Good evening, everybody. Welcome. What an honor to see each of you here today. My name is Florence Glanfield. I have the honor of serving the University of Alberta as Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research. But I'm here today because I'm also part of a research team, a group of amazing humans from around the world who've been participating in, and excuse me as I attempt to pronounce this, Gare Ranga Tiratanga Dadiri, decolonizing the capture of knowledge. And this is a group of universities that have all been involved through, or all connected through the Worldwide University Network. So we've been meeting since 2020, just as the pandemic broke out. We've been meeting online, and we've gathered together in a hybrid format to engage in further conversation around the concept of deep listening. So I'm going to invite us to start in a good way, first of all with our elder, Elmer Ghostkeeper, a citizen of the Buffalo Lake Métis Nation, or Métis settlement, oh boy. and then I'll proceed to just thank a few people before we start the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. Tansikeo na school tana ao ka pedohti ki pita mi koma ka we speak ko atamak ao school South Africa to Cape Town. Mansikeo, I welcome you all here this evening to listen to words of wisdom from June from Cape Town University, South Africa. She's doing amazing work and part of the World University Network. So I'm going to begin in a good way, make sure we create an ethical space and where we can share worldviews back and forth that are equally recognized and appreciated. And I'm going to say the prayer in my first language, which is Bushland Cree. Maui no tawi mau, e gua ke gani no, aswi tamanana samana, a samana mo tika pe tuhti ach, te pi pihta mak, awa squeo, we acha mot we stamina. Me na, Mr. He, ke tamina wao, a samana mi gosi akuma, gisagao. Me na, te mi machihta akuma, ka we speak squeet. Ego ne, bita ma muhtawi mau ke gani no, merci go hai hai.
Marcy. So this evening, you're here to hear about colonial intersectionalities, the experiences of Indigenous peoples across two lands. And you'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end. I want to be respectful and acknowledge all of the support we've received for, first of all, our colleagues from South Africa to join us here, and then for the support of the community of the University of Alberta. Just a little story. A year ago, there was a talk in South Africa hosted by the San and Koi Center on the same day as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And the Canadian High Commissioner of South Africa attended that talk. And I too was invited because I'm a partner with June on this grant. And at the end of the conversation, he said, how can I support further collaboration? How can the office support further collaboration? So one of the event sponsors tonight is the Canadian High Commissioner in South Africa, Chris Cooter. A second really important sponsor tonight is the Canadian Council of UNESCO. And we are so honored to have Barbara Fillion with us to share a bit about the work that they are doing as well. And as you may or may not know, 2022 to 2032 is designated sort of the decade of Indigenous languages. And why that's important is that about 2.5 years ago, we were very privileged to access funding to support Indigenous language revitalization from the community-led perspective. And so we've been working hard with Indigenous communities across this place we now call Alberta, Canada, and working to support them in their language revitalization efforts. So along with that, we've also had tremendous support from the Situated Knowledge's Indigenous Peoples in Place signature area, the COOL study, or KIAS, for those of you who are connected with the University of Alberta. And I've mentioned the project supporting Indigenous language revitalization, and of course, the Worldwide University Network, and our engagement as an institution. So we're going to start off with a few words, a recorded message from the Canadian High Commissioner, and just to welcome you to this space.
Hello everyone, I'm Chris Cooter, the Canadian High Commissioner in South Africa, and I'm delighted you've invited me to offer a few words of support today from here in Victoria. First, let me say I'm really encouraged that South Africa and Canada are now actively collaborating on these ever more important issues around indigeneity. We have a lot to learn from each other, and I foresee a long and I'm sure productive journey ahead. It may seem entirely natural to the participants in your discussions that an embassy of Canada should be engaged on issues affecting the Indigenous peoples of Southern Africa. But in fact, this is a new and emerging area for us in South Africa, and I've been really fortunate to speak recently with Indigenous experts and advocates to better understand the issues, to draw comparisons to the Canadian experience, and to look for areas where we may be able to assist. As you know, reconciliation, a term that we borrowed from South Africa, is a top Government of Canada priority. Demonstrating that, in May, our visiting Parliamentary Secretary, Arif Virani, was extremely pleased to meet with June Van Hutchison, Director of the Sand and Koi Centre at the University of Cape Town, who is with you today. And there's a growing interest in Ottawa to hear more about South Africa's experience of indigeneity. I know that there is also a fresh and expanding interest on the South African side too. I had, for example, a fascinating meeting with University of Cape Town Vice Chancellor, Professor Lekang, who has thrown her full support behind June's Centre. As such, we were pleased at the High Commission to be able to facilitate June's participation in your conference. So despite the distance and the differences between how indigeneity is evolving in both our countries, we regard your work, exemplified by this conference, as very important to follow. From the High Commission, with the full backing of Ottawa, we are committed to working with partners such as you. A year ago, I was able to join Professor Lekang and Professors Glanfield and Van Hutchison at an acknowledgement of land cleansing ceremony. That event almost coincided with Canada's first marking of September 30th as a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Since then, we've been strengthening our networks with Indigenous peoples in South Africa and Namibia, a country we also cover. When we embarked on this new area, we found that traditional human rights partners were unaware of Koi and San issues and didn't have contacts in those communities. That's changing now as we shift the dialogue. We're also starting to use tools such as our Canada Fund for local initiatives. For example, we're working with the Kwatusan Culture and Education Centre near Cape Town to promote heritage-based livelihoods and to train San entrepreneurs to benefit from tourism opportunities. With the University of Namibia and Indigenous peoples of that country, we're working to record and celebrate Indigenous knowledge systems and crafts. Also in Namibia, we're working with the Legal Resources Centre to protect the rights of the Himba people over land and resources. And we've been supporting and highlighting our Canadian mining firm B2 Gold, which has helped to open San language schools. Plus, stay tuned for it because the amazing June Award-winning Indigenous duo Digging Roots will be touring South Africa very soon. This is part of the WOMAD Festival in September and October, which includes Indigenous musical groups from Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And finally, at the High Commission itself, we're working to increase understanding of Indigenous issues both in Canada and South Africa. Our new Diversity and Inclusion Committee will this year, for the first time, be helping educate staff about the meaning of Indigenous culture in order to mark September 30th, our Truth and Reconciliation Day. You have experts in the room who are far better equipped than me to speak to the topics of this session. So we'll be in listening mode, listening to you with great interest after the sun rises in South Africa, of course. Let me simply conclude by wishing you a great discussion. I and the High Commission staff look forward to walking the path toward mutual understanding with all of you. Thanks very much.
And now I'd like to invite Barbara to tell us a bit about the really important work of UNESCO and particularly Canadian Council UNESCO.
Kwe Tansei. Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Florence, and to the University of Alberta for inviting me to be here tonight and part of this amazing conference, and everyone who made this conference possible. Today I heard so many stories, perspectives, and ideas that moved and inspired me. I'm Barbara Filion. I'm from the Innu Nation of Mashtuiach of Pakwikami on my father's side, and I'm a settler on my mom's side. And I'm also here as the Program Officer of Culture for the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, or CC-UNESCO as we call it. I'm just going to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about CC-UNESCO and the work that I do. As some of you may know, UNESCO stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, and it's part of the United Nations orbit. UNESCO was founded after the Second World War to promote a more peaceful world through the intellectual and moral solidarity of humankind. And this is done by supporting information exchange and international dialogue, and the Canadian Commission for UNESCO promotes UNESCO values and programs in Canada, while also bringing voices of Canadians to the world stage. We are a forum of reflection and a catalyst for action for UNESCO's priorities. As you can imagine, there are many initiatives and programs in the cultural sphere, and tonight I'd like to focus on the UN's International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And as a friend of mine pointed out, forms a great acronym, UNIDLE, which I think captures the urgency with which we must ramp up and continue to build programs and initiatives to strengthen Indigenous languages. The decade is both personally and professionally important to me as an Innu person who didn't get to learn my language, Inuamun. At CC-UNESCO, any work we do is always rooted in collaboration. For the decade, we continue to build on the work we have advanced with Indigenous partners that grew out of the 2019 Year of Indigenous Languages. And we have ramped up this work as we kick off the first year of the decade. CC-UNESCO has been very busy raising awareness and visibility about the importance of Indigenous languages, first and foremost as a human right. All Indigenous peoples have the right to thrive and transmit our cultures and languages to future generations and preserve our human dignity. And Indigenous peoples' lifeways, relationships, and languages hold irreplaceable environmental knowledge that teaches everyone to live in reciprocity with Mother Earth. In other words, Indigenous worldviews already exemplify how culture and sustainability go hand in hand. Recognizing that languages are pillars of identity and culture, and that protecting linguistic diversity and biodiversity are interlinked, we are taking a holistic approach to advancing the goals of the decade. We're mobilizing all of our sectors to contribute. And most importantly, to guide our work, CC-UNESCO has established a working group of Indigenous language leaders and advocates, including Elmer Ghostkeeper, who's here with us tonight. Together, we aspire to find ways to contribute to initiatives with meaningful impacts that will echo and resonate beyond the decade. There are many projects and initiatives that I'd love to tell you about, but in the interest of time, I'll just tell you about one project that I'm excited about, and we've been calling it the Greetings Project. We've been working with Dr. Anawa McIver's team at the University of Victoria, who have gathered over 80 greetings in Indigenous languages from Turtle Island. And the next step is to make them readily available to the general public. This is part of our process of normalizing the use of Indigenous languages and contributing to truth-telling, because when the original language of a territory is recognized, be it by sharing a greeting or an original place name, it acknowledges the generations of Indigenous nations, communities, and individuals that have cared for these lands since time immemorial. Before I go ahead and introduce June, I want to acknowledge the many organizations, communities, and individuals who work diligently to strengthen Indigenous languages, oftentimes voluntarily and with very few resources. This hard work is yet another expression of the resilience of our peoples. It's my pleasure and honor to be able to present June Bam Hutchinson, who I just met today and has already inspired and heartened me. This speaks to her passion and presence. June Bam Hutchinson grew up on the Cape Flats and holds an interdisciplinary PhD in Sociology and History Education Historiography from the University of Stellenbosch, and a master's degree and other qualifications from the University of Cape Town. She has taught for many years at schools, colleges, and universities, and served as a special national advisor to the Minister of Education of South Africa from 2001 to 2004 for the country's first post-apartheid history project. She has been appointed in research associate positions at the University of York and Kingston University in the UK, and as a visiting professor and course convener on Sites of Memory in Stanford University's overseas program. She teaches in African Feminism and African Studies as Associate Professor and has headed the Department of African Studies and established the new Department of African Studies and Linguistics at the University of Cape Town. She has published widely and has recently published 3 books on Indigenous knowledge, of which 2 have been nominated for national awards. Whose History Counts, co-edited with Zin and Nsebeza in 2018, and was runner-up for the National Institute for Human and Social Sciences Inaugural Book Awards, and her single-authored Osi Told Me has been recently nominated for South Africa's Non-Fiction Literary Awards. The 3rd book with Muthien is titled Rethinking Africa, Indigenous Women Reinterpret Southern Africa's Past. Her previous collaborative work for the Ministry of Education has won the 2008 UNESCO Peace Education Prize for South Africa. She has worked internationally in senior positions in heritage and higher education and has led the University of Cape Town's transformation projects, the naming of the Sarah Bartman Memorial Hall and the university's language policy to include erased Indigenous languages. As co-founder of the San and Khoi Center in collaboration with the community Sarah Restorative Justice Forum, she served as inaugural director and introduced the Khoi Khoi Kuab course for free in 2019 for descendant communities at a historically white university in South Africa, which saw the certification of 200 people, including unemployed youth. June is of the San and Khoi people of South Africa through her mother's matrilineal line and mother of adult sons and a grandmother to a girl child. Please join me in welcoming June.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you, audience, for this, for esteemed guests, elders, dignitaries, colleagues, students. I'm really feel very blessed to be here and very honored. And first of all, I would like to acknowledge this land, because this presentation is broadcasted at the University of Alberta, and therefore I'd like to acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respect the histories, languages and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich their vibrant community. I'm greatly honored. Thank you. I also want to thank the Worldwide University Network for making this possible, especially the colleagues, Florence, Glanville, and all my other colleagues, the Maori colleague, Aboriginal Australia, and everybody else who made this all possible. A big thank you to the Canadian High Commissioner to South Africa, Chris Cooter, whom you've just met, was very committed to this work and has been a great support, as Florence has mentioned, and as you can hear in his speech. So, Tavades, greetings in the language my mother was barred from speaking, and which has inspired me to be who I am today and the work that I do with passion and commitment, and which gets me up at 2 in the morning, because there's so much to do still. So I've been renamed by the San people as Musuva, which means forgetting in order to remember. And they named me that when my mom passed over, and they made a little ostrich totem for me to have for carrying on the knowledge that is different to colonial knowledge, and to keep me anchored in that knowledge. And so that was the telepathy totem that was handed to me exactly 10 years ago. 12 years actually ago. And so that I can continue the work that will give dignity to children who are massacred by colonialism right into our present and where we stand in the world. And this happened to many children, and I want to pause and think of us to think and pause for the children of this land was trying to find their way home to the stars. And they are just like the children that my mother came from. And so they're just children who couldn't be allowed to be. And it is that gets me up at 2 in the morning so that these things never ever happen today and ever in the world again. With that, I'm greeting you from the San and Khoi people that I come from the most southern tip of Africa, nearest to the South Pole, from Kamisa, the place of sweet waters, and Khoi Cape, the place where the clouds gather. I was born in the place of sweet waters and the place where clouds gather on a day of great floods. As the great-granddaughter of the National Secretary of the Griqua movement, who visited the Union Parliament often since the 1920s to ask for the British government to return the land. My great-grandfather was a known San cracker. In other words, he had great knowledge of the animals and how to find your way as a hunter. And so I come from that long line of that knowledge deep within the Southern African landscape and the rock paintings. And I'm therefore going to try and speak my mother's language that she was barred from speaking. And I'm going to say, I therefore bring you greetings from our people of the lands of the Khoi and San, and that I'm going to put it this way, and it's going to be difficult because our tongues were also mutilated. So at the age of 12, my dental structure was mutilated by a white Afrikaans doctor. And so only later did we understand that so many of us with this heritage can't do the clicks. And this was a long tradition of mutilation of the mouth. And so I struggle with the 4 clicks, but I still try. Tita gen tabate, tira ha upas tu, koin chi san di toho. We honor you and thank you for receiving us. Sida gera toitu, chi gangandu, sida to twas aruma. I got it. In Cape Town, if you've been to Cape Town, if you know Cape Town, you'll see people with mutilated structures, dental parts, and it's called the passion cap. It's got nothing to do with passion. It's actually got to do with the mutilation of San and Khoi descendant people who came to be called colored under apartheid, and through the long, long violence of apartheid and colonialism at the Cape, the mouths, the tongues were mutilated, and they're very much similar to what happened on these lands. South Africa doesn't speak about this. Our Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't address these things, and people live with this shame. And they come, my generation, they do that. So I've overcome that, and I smile, and I do the clicks, and I try. My inspiration comes particularly from my mother, who's called O.C. May. And I always thought that the word O.C. means oldest, because in Afrikaans it sounds like oldest, O-U-S-I-E. But in fact, I learned later that this is a Khoi Kuvap word. So it means the one who is the eldest with the knowledge. My mother kept a very painful secret with her And she pretended she couldn't. She had the secret that she could speak kwekuwap and the clicks, but she pretended she couldn't because it was a shame being a savage. And so she didn't teach her daughters that. And it's only when I returned from the Sarah Baartman reburial, Sarah Baartman, the Khoi woman, was paraded at Piccadilly in London in the early 1800s and then put on display after death. Her intimate parts were bottled and put on display in the Museum of Mankind in Paris. And then she was returned after it was discovered, and you may know that story very well. The current Yvette Abrams, who's leading at the Kosan and Khoi Center currently, she's sort of the iconic scholar on this work. And so it's only with that reburial that my mother admitted, first of all, that she played in Yankee where Sarah was reburied, and that she could speak the clicks and the language. And she spoke to me secretly in the bedroom about the language, and she said it's a secret. And she also had 2 marks on her arm, on her left arm, upper arm, and she said, oh, that I got around the fire. And then later after her death, I found out from her cousin, who was, she was the mentor to this cousin, who was the choir master for Sarah Baartman's reburial, and he had to curate her burial. And I wanted to know, why is he there? You know, what is the connection? Why is the family there? So she said, because we of those people, and she didn't speak about those marks, but when I spoke to my uncle, he said, oh, you do know that is the OC marks, the knowledge keeper. And we both got those marks around the fire. And then he showed me his marks and said, we got these marks when we were 12 years old around the fire, because it meant an important transition in the Indigenous knowledge world of looking after the ecosystems. So knowing and having this knowledge, knowing the plants, knowing the astronomy, knowing the language, and protecting the plants through certain secrets, and making sure the ecosystems are also protected. And for that reason, she had those marks. So all of these things were kept as a secret because of the fear that came with colonialism and colonial education. I later also learned, she said to me, as asked, she couldn't read and write. Initially, she taught herself to read and write because she spent one day at school, one single day. And the reason why she never went back to school after that one day is because the teachers singled her out and said, and got the children to gather in the courtyard, and there was a tree, and the teacher simulated a hanging, and the teacher sort of said, I'm going to hang her, and sort of loosely, tried to do a kind of lynching, and pretended to make a little fire under her, all mock. And of course the children screamed, and she, of course I was so traumatized. And then he said, I'm doing this to show you what happens to people with hair like this. San Indigenous Khoi looking hair. This is what happens to children like this. And Mama Veni let her go, and she ran and ran into the veld. Because in the veld, she knew about the plant roots, she knew about the berries, she knew about the inedible berries, the edible berries, she knew how to survive, she knew how to quench her thirst, she knew how to read the time without looking in the sand, she knew how the movement of insects and what they meant, and she knew where the spring waters were, and so, and all of those things. And then she had confidence there, and their children were safe with the Indigenous knowledge and their cliques and their languages, and they would not be hanging from a tree or killed. So my mother shared the story, but she started to shake, and she started to shake and she shared the stories, and she shared the fact that she could speak this language, and the hospital diagnosed it as Parkinson's. And so, until her last breath, she said, we must learn to listen, and listen very deeply. And we must learn to respect and understand the importance of nature and ecosystems. So every Sunday, the children were taken into the veld, and we had to walk, the eldest and then the youngest at the back, and for lessons in the veld. And these were called Dream Sundays. And so we go with the OCs into the veld, the women, as they were taught, and you were taught all about the medicines. What is an antiviral? What is an antibiotic? How many days? Very scientific. The cycles of the antibiotic, the cycles of the antiviral plant. The plant for constipation, the plant for diarrhea. The plant that's like an antiseptic, the plant for eczema. And so I can do that as like a chemist. And so we were taught that from the age of about 4. And it's a knowledge that she said we should keep, because should disaster strike and there's no longer food security, one day there will be floods and droughts and fires, and then we must know how to survive. And also to be still in the veld and in the bush, and to watch the movement of the ant, the movement of the bee, the vibration of the leaves, and to respect all of that. That inspired me, knowing how she was abused, knowing how she was made to feel ashamed of her looks as an Indigenous person, knowing how she was made to feel ashamed of the language she was speaking, and also the knowledge she had that's so important for us in the world today. It really inspired me to take this forward. And she said she always wanted the children to be the professor at the historically white University of Hurikwahu Mountain rising out of the sea. Now, the University of Cape Town, where it is there, it had to be established. It was established by erasing, of course, Indigenous landscape, and then, of course, erasing the people from the landscape. And so it's also built on burial grounds of Indigenous people, and that's where the Rhodes Must Fall statue was removed from not so long ago. It was all very symbolic to bring this back and to really transform the university, that the university cannot be a space where there's important knowledge that will really mean sustaining future communities and taking care of our children, cannot ignore this knowledge. It has to really take this knowledge very seriously, because it's also very scientific knowledge. And for that reason, I brought the language back into the region where it was erased. Well, I'm trying to, but putting very important steps into place. So today it's also in the handbook of the university, which was not easy. It sounds easy, but it's not easy in these systems, colonial systems, to do exactly that. So it is a long violence, as the Maori scholar in our research project with the Worldwide University, as Tracy McIntosh puts it in our deep listening circles. There are the ways of knowing that we need to get the students to really understand. So if we teach about decolonization, and of course in our circles we realize that it is a problematic word, how can we use and think about those in languages and concepts that would have meaning? The trauma is intergenerational, as you know, so it doesn't stop with your mother. It goes on with the children. So it went on with me and the white doctor, and what the white doctor did to me. So I'll struggle with cliques. And then it also goes on, even the teacher in the classroom, if you're dreaming about the Indigenous world, and because you can't really understand this teacher speaking about plants and things that you haven't really seen in your reality, The teacher doesn't understand why you want to study the movement of ants. The teacher just thinks that there's something wrong with you. And so I got beaten up every day. I'm sure it was every day, to start the class. The teacher was the youngest in class, and the teacher, she just hated this Indigenous knowledge and other ways of thinking, and the questions I was asking as a result of Dream Sundays and what I was being taught on those Sundays by the OCs in the veld. And so the teacher would take me out of the class. First thing, when the class starts, she takes me out from my little chair, puts me in front, she gives me a big hiding. Everybody sees, I'm sorted, puts me back, and then the colonial education continues, uninterrupted. So nobody's dreaming, nobody's asking about ants, nobody's asking about the plants that are not our reality, and nobody's asking about the reader that these white children in the veld, but with a caravan and a turkey as a pet and a baboon as a pet, enjoying cheese and a set table in the veld. Because, we are the berries. When are they learning about how to read the time? Why is the mother setting the table in the bush? Why aren't they watching the birds and the movement of the birds and the bees? And so, very systematically, through corporal punishment, Indigenous knowledge was beaten out of us. And of course, with apartheid as the next layer, right? So it's the Indigenous knowledge, colonial erasure, but then also the apartheid layer of trauma, and we had to resist that. And of course, I became then an anti-apartheid activist as well, trying to get this knowledge being taken seriously and being respected in South Africa's education system. You will be surprised, but still today, there's a difficulty in recognizing the San and Khoi people in South Africa. We've got an act, but the act is still very much trying to bring in apartheid, sort of Verwoerdian thinking, Verwoerd being the sort of Nazi government official in South Africa who brought about the apartheid laws. And so there's a lot of trying to take people back to that kind of thinking. So people think of themselves as having pure DNA and being 100% this and 100% that. And this kind of narrative is being encouraged. So our challenge is, how do you decolonize and how do you position Indigenous knowledge and put it at the center, while at the same time you're also not bringing back those Verwoerdian neo-Nazi discourses on people being so pure and static and so on. Therefore, this knowledge of the OCs, because the OCs have this knowledge of ceremony, of what we call a ritual around the fire, of long ago, of deep time, of the landscape of where the sea was once, and why are we speaking about Urikwaho, and about the animals that once were, the extinction. And so the OCs, these women and their knowledges, it's one way, one pathway into that, and breaking through the frontiers of very fixed notions of people and place. And it's also the OCs and those women that are the healers, and they do the massage and dealing with what we call a kaisena, or sickness of, when we refer to the misplacement of the internal organs. It's also the OCs who get you to know to eat the glue of the tree, to cleanse the internal organs. It's also the OCs who know the importance of looking after the land, the fire, and the resources, and taking care of the livestock. And my mother's role was to pull off the hide and make the leather and make the shoes. And to use the medicine and teach the formula. And so when we listen to the OCs, we then also understand just the deep time of that presence in South Africa. We also understand how people have connections and how they share language and knowledge. And that gets us to really being able to trouble the way the archaeologists deal with bones, which they call my bones, which are actually human remains, and what the community calls, the San and Khoi community calls, they've got, university has our sacred remains. They have our remains in their drawers and stuff, children and all sorts of things, of people, sorry, not things. And these people need to be put to rest. These children need to be buried. And so it's through the community that we are really troubling these notions and concepts of colonialism and its brutal forms in the disciplines and ways of doing. So you don't speak about my bones, as an archaeologist. You've got to have that respect. And for that reason, through the San and Khoi Center, and the Kara Restorative Justice Forum that we set up a few years ago, is to really co-design and co-create knowledge in order to come at a better, fuller understanding of our humanity and the heart knowledges we've been speaking in our circles. There's also the notion that the Cape and the people at the Cape, they were just fixed people, never changing, past of fauna and flora. And so we're also changing that through doing the studies of just how connected we are linguistically in our language, and that trade must have happened there so long ago. So it wasn't that it was first contact. The case of the contact with the Phoenicians, the reading of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the 1st century AD, it all gives us insights into indigeneity and that First Nations understanding beyond frontiers. We also get into the knowing resistance, that people had agency, that they weren't just wiped out or they died with the smallpox of the 1700s, which is the other myth, that we've all died out. These colleagues would speak to you about the San and Khoi people as if you somehow disconnected from the indigenous people. And they'd speak about, their bones and stuff that they're studying. But by actually working with the knowledge of the women, with the OC, we can trouble all these paradigms. And so we're building a digital archive to do exactly that. So I speak about the 7 concomitant erasures of colonialism, which I see. I've been to the exhibition of the experiences of Indigenous people here in Turtle Island, and I was most amazed at the strong resonance. I was like, oh my word, this is exactly what OC told me. The book that I wrote captures so much of what I also saw here in terms of the experiences. And those 7 concomitant erasures, that went with genocide, linguicide, epistemicide, faunacide, botanicide. It was this whole system of ongoing violence and intersecting layers of violence. These OCs ended up working as domestic workers in white homes, where they're seen as vacuous people who can only really clean. But they were used to make candles from the plants and soap. And to work with leather, because the settler colony knew that the labor they have is important, but they wouldn't give acknowledgement to that knowledge. And so it's about getting that knowledge back. And so we can't really get the knowledge back unless we get the languages back, because the erased languages have the knowledge embedded in them in terms of the metaphors, the meaning, the deep meaning of deep pasts, things we can never really understand just by one word. And it's that I think is very, very central to what we need to do in terms of deep listening. We can't do deep listening with the English hegemonic language. It just doesn't work. We do it, but it's just sometimes we are just silent and loudly silent because it speaks more. So if I want to speak about the knowledge that is captured within the matrilineal line, if I say the word Osi, or I say the word Danap, or I say the word Danas, Taras, it gains a whole ecosystem of knowledge that you cannot really even describe in words. And so it's that kind of restorative justice that bringing back an Indigenous language within the university system can do. I would say that we need to start to ask the new questions about our disciplines, how they're responsible for complicities in epistemicide and the concomitant erasures, and how they stop us from really listening with respect and with really listening for what it is we need to do and to really bring about this new world so that things are not repeated and violence, structural violence, doesn't continue. Because I believe that we work, and I think all of us probably here, we work with deficient models inherited from Eurocentric and Western disciplines, which involve the destruction of Indigenous knowledge ecologies and also self-determination, epistemological self-determination. And we constantly capitulate back into the Western models within the systems, because the systems in universities and in education systems tend to be systemic racist, and so we can't get out of it, and we need the resources for that. The Western way of knowing has exposed its gross fault lines and severe limitations, especially during COVID. It's important to keep the intergenerational fire of our sustainable knowledge systems alive as we go through experiencing this slow destruction of the earth and life. And we can only attain this wisdom of sustaining our humanity and our becoming, our constant relational becoming, as we call it Ubuntu in South Africa, that we need to get to by doing ukushlumbulula, by doing cleansing of those colonial systems of thinking and ways of knowing, through the practice of deep listening in different ways with our eyes, our ears, not only our ears, our eyes, and other intuitive senses and forms of telepathy, and Indigenous sensibilities that we have that are embedded in our metaphors, our concepts, our proverbs. And we attain this wisdom by centering our Indigenous languages in a very catalytic way. It can spark these changes and different ways of thinking and knowing. And in doing that, we'll find our shared knowledges, our shared ways of understanding how we relate to one another across frontiers, across oceans, and across the lands. If this is not done, and if we do not go on this journey, I think we will have to face the reality of more children being killed, massacred, mutilated, all kinds of things, because we do not understand the importance of respecting their tongues. Thank you.
Wow. Just trying to process all of the words, June, the powerful words. Thank you for sharing. When we were thinking about who we could invite to offer a response and to share the experiences of Indigenous peoples in this place we call Canada, the first person that came to my mind was my good friend and colleague, Dr. Dwayne Donald. From the very first time that Dwayne and I met, and we drove in many cars out to reserves and down to working with teachers and educators, we'd have these long, long conversations. And I know the deep wisdom that Dwayne holds. Dwayne comes from the Papa's Chase, the land that was given to Papa's Chase is where North Campus now sits. So this university is built, and the land was taken away from Papa's Chase, even though they had signed treaty. But I'm so incredibly proud of the work that Dwayne does in unpacking and teaching and helping Canadians and Indigenous peoples, and Canadians to learn more about Indigenous peoples, I think. He was recently granted a Canada Research Chair Tier 1 in Indigenous teacher education, and that is pretty significant because I believe, I've had the honor of reading the proposal, I believe that there's a shift in our granting agencies to respect and honor Indigenous knowledges. So I'm so honored to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Dwayne Donald, and thank you, Dwayne, for joining us this evening.
Kakio kitatum skatanoho. Niga ne naska mama motoyuma kasi manito. Anoka kiska kekwa matsu and kitsiwatsat. I just wanted to greet you all and express some thanks for another day, for life, for all the gifts that we have, all these opportunities we're given. I want to thank my friend Florence for inviting me here to share a few things, and as I understand it, my role here is to respond to June as best I can in my own kind of humble way, and do that in a way that invites some of you, or all of you, I guess, to respond as well. I think we kind of want to have a conversation here if we can. So I'm going to take a little time here to share some things that I want to talk about. And what I have in mind is to share almost like a life narrative of experiences with colonialism up to the present. Of course, just small vignettes. As I was listening to June, I was thinking about that experience that we're all very familiar with, where as you listen to someone share personal stories and struggles, what it does is it causes you to think about your own life and your own struggles and your own identity and all those things, and reflect on all of those, right? That's why it's so meaningful to listen to people tell stories, because it provokes us to think about ourselves. The way I think about this, after many years of pondering all this, is that I think that for us in this part of the world anyway, when Columbus did what he did, however long ago that was, what we've had is a centuries-long, very gradual imposition of a particular way to understand life and living, and to understand what it means to live well as a human being. This has been, at times, a very violent imposition. And of course, all of us have experienced that imposition in different ways. Doesn't matter who we are or where we come from, I would say. We all have that experience with colonialism. But because of our different positions, our different identities, we've experienced it differently. But as an educator, it's hard for me to admit, but schools are the places where this imposition has been enacted most intensely. And this is something that we need to have to try to recover from. And myself, I think that our struggles maybe to live in less ecologically damaging ways are directly connected to our ability to reimagine ourselves as human beings and recover from colonialism. The next story I want to share has to do with that image you see there. And it has to do with when I became a father. Before our son was born, there was a few old men that I used to hang out with, and one day one of them said to me, he said, your child, he's traveling right now. He said they go to the spirit world and then they come back. And he said when he starts to walk around on his own, he's going to start to say things from that spirit time that are going to astonish you. He said, you listen to him, he's going to teach you something. We lived in a town called Fort Macleod in those days. And for those of you not from here, or maybe you don't know the story, Fort Macleod is kind of an iconic place if you're into Western Canadian history, or at least a particular version of Western Canadian history, right? Because what happened at Fort Macleod is that a regiment of Northwest Mounted Police was sent west from what we call Winnipeg now to establish law and order in what we call southern Alberta now. And so in 1874, they built Fort Macleod. And that's where we lived at this time that my boy was just starting to walk around. Fort Macleod it's a museum now. It's a fort recreated as a museum. We have a lot of these in Canada. And it's a very popular place to visit in the summer. Maybe some of you have been there. And one of the reasons it's so popular is, first of all, it's right along the main highway, but the other thing is that there at the fort they hire high school students to recreate the musical ride of the Northwest Mounted Police, where they get dressed up in the period costumes and they take the horses and the different patterns that they ride. It's nice to watch. Well, if you live in Fort Macleod, you know that this goes on during the summer, during the tourist season, 5 or 6 times a year, or a day. I can't remember if it's 5 or 6. But when the musical ride is going on, they play this really annoying music that you can hear all across, just a little town, about 3,000 people. So you can hear this music and you know what's going on with the horses. So this summer, our son was about 2.5, and he loved horses at that time. So whenever he heard that music, he insisted on going to see this musical ride. And I got pretty tired of this, right? Because I always had to go with him. And we'd hustle over there, and he would kind of stand outside the fence and just watch everything. It got to the point where I knew when the music was going to come on, and I'd try to get him inside so he wouldn't hear it, so we wouldn't have to go. But that summer, I was helping him get ready for bed, and he looked at me right in the eye, and he said, "Dad, I don't want to be an Indian anymore." Wow, yeah, you can imagine how that felt. Still feels it right here in my belly button when I say that. It's hard to hear. And he was growing up in a house where the message was quite different, Anyway, I tried not to overreact. I didn't want to censor him. I wanted to listen to what he had to say. So I sat down and kind of took a deep breath, and I said, "Oh, is that right? Why is that?" And he said, "Indians always lose." So I find it astonishing that a child that young could articulate something so clearly. He could pick up on that element of our society and articulate it so directly. So that was a gift from my son. Just like the old man said he was going to teach me something, and he did. So that was the title of my dissertation. The Pedagogy of the Fort, which is a fancy way to say, what do forts teach? Here's the basics of what I had to say about this. If you go to school in Canada, especially Western Canada, what you're told is that before the forts arrived, nothing important happened around here. History really only begins when the forts arrived. That's when we can begin to talk about civilization and progress and all of these things that are a really important part of that worldview. So we got this four-cornered version of civilization that gets brought to what's considered empty land, and then it gets plunked down, and slowly over the years, those four walls get expanded. The people inside the fort claim more and more, and the people outside get pushed to the margins. So it's my view that forts act like social spatial organizers in Canadian society. What they teach is that There are insiders and there are outsiders. And that these people live in separate realities, and kind of that, so that wall acts like an anthropological divide. And it's considered natural. It's a social spatial organizer in the sense that it's in what was imposed on the land in terms of the fort is imposed on people. We learn to divide the world according to these logics. And it becomes naturalized and normalized in our society. It's accepted as common sense. It's my view that most of our institutions are based on this fort logic. Schools act like forts, universities act like forts. You could even say curriculum documents, which I studied, or textbooks act like forts. And so learning that from my son, I've thought a lot about, what's it going to take for us to recover from this relationship denial legacy that we've inherited and its dominance. What's it going to take for us to recover? I want to say that a big part of what I try to do and the role I have is to help people study colonialism as an inheritance, and in a way that helps us understand that it's not just a historic event or a period. It's a worldview, it's a structure, and it has its own kind of logics that continue to dominate. For myself, kind of continuing on further along in my life and my experience, I've come to see that there's a relational psychosis that exists in our society. Now, I'm not qualified to diagnose psychoses, I have to say. I'm not that kind of doctor. I understand that psychosis as kind of a blockage. It's something that gets in the way of our ability to connect, our ability to relate. And the psychosis takes many forms, but it's mostly based on relationship denial. In other words, this psychosis teaches us to deny relationships with other humans, but also with what gives us life. So a couple of characteristics of this psychosis that I'll share with you, and then I'll finish with the story. The first one has to do with whose land this is. And with the land acknowledgements that we're getting used to these days, that's, I think, more and more of a consideration for people. Whose land is this? And so what I would say is that if a Canadian can look at an Indigenous person and can acknowledge, well, that person's from here. This is their place. They have deep roots in this place. If they can do that, what it does is it immediately conjures up a contradiction, because what it suggests is that a Canadian is a foreigner in Canada. And it's my view that Canadian colonial culture is based on avoiding facing this contradiction. And most of the way we can understand the history of oppression and all the different things that have happened to Indigenous people at the hands of Canadian government policy has to do with refusing to face this contradiction. I would say, just as a quick example, that this is one of the reasons that it was so important to remove or take away the ability for Indigenous people to circulate with the regular Canadian population, to sort of treat those reserves like concentration camps and those schools like prisons, so that Canadians wouldn't have to be faced with this contradiction by these people in front of them who conjure up the contradiction. So remove them so that we don't have to deal with them. The second one that I wanted to mention that's part of this relational psychosis is this issue of ownership. The way I would explain this is that if Canada claims sovereignty, if they claim ownership over the land and the resources, and if Indigenous people are understood to be connected to the land, well, if you own the land, then you own the people. If you decide that you own the people, then you own everything about them. You own their language, you own their culture, you own their sacred artifacts, and you would even go so far as to say that you own their children, and you can do with them what you want, right? So this problem of ownership and its kind of connectedness to colonial psychosis is another issue that we have to deal with. Now, all of this in relation to what June was saying, I wanted to mention, in case some of you don't know this, and I don't know if this has ever actually been sort of confirmed, but the story is that when the National Party was elected in 1948 in South Africa, and they began instituting the apartheid system, South Africa sent government officials to Canada to study the reserve system, to see how it worked. And so what people say is that the homeland system, or the Bantustan system in South Africa, was based on Canada's reserve system. And so they just applied it in their own way. So that's another legacy for us that we have to deal with. Something that Canada exported, I guess, that maybe a lot of us don't know about. I'm aware that I'm dealing with a lot of difficult things here, and it doesn't feel very good for me either. So I wanted to finish with the story, because I think stories can help us out here, because part of what I'm interested in the research that I do is understanding that wisdom sits in places. And if we need direction on how to proceed differently, it involves our connection to the places that give us life and our understanding of the ancient wisdom that still lives there, that we can call upon to guide us. And so I think this is kind of a wisdom story. Maybe you can decide. I was assured this is a true story. So, this is about Old Man Bruised Head. His wife had passed away a few years earlier. And so he was living by himself, and he was getting used to it. He kind of liked it that way. He liked doing his own thing and kind of following his own routines. So he was living by himself in kind of isolated part of the reserve, kind of over by the river. In those days, the kids were starting to have to go to school. And so he didn't see his family very much because of, all this. But every once, maybe a couple times a year, they would come out and visit him at his place there. And he always enjoyed those visits, get to see his grandkids. But what happened often is when they were visiting, is the grandkids would say to him, Grandpa, you should come to church with us. We're worried you're going to go to hell. At first he sort of politely declined. He said, oh, no, that's okay. I have my pipe, I have my sweetgrass. I'm good, I'm covered. I talk to God every day. I'm all right. He said that school, or that church, that's for you, young folks. That's good, you learn about that. You find out more about that. But they were persistent. They wouldn't leave it alone. Whenever they'd come to visit, they would ask him. So I guess he kind of got worn out and eventually broke down. He said, okay, all right, tell the priest he can come. Come, bring him over here. I'll listen to what he has to say. So that's what happened. On the day the family arrived and the priest was with them. So while he was there, the priest gave Bruised Head the basics of Christianity, the story of Jesus, and all the different parts to it that he thought he should know. And then when he was done, he said, okay, if you're going to be a Catholic, there's a couple of things we have to do. He said, first of all, we're going to change your name. So he had some holy water and he sprinkled it on his head. And he said, from now on, you're not Bruised Head anymore. We're going to call you John. He said, oh, okay, John. And then the priest said, okay, if you're going to be a Catholic, like the rest of us, you can't eat meat on Friday. You got to eat fish. Fish, okay. So they all went away, and Bruised Head was thinking about, I guess John was thinking about all this that he had learned. But he was most concerned about the fish, because he wasn't sure he was going to be able to eat on Friday. So he decided to go down to the river and try his luck a few days before. He wasn't a very good fisherman, didn't have a lot of luck. Finally Friday came, and they say he got up early and went down to the river and was there most of the morning into the afternoon, and by this time his stomach was complaining quite a bit, and he gave up and went back to the house. And he's trying to figure out what to do. So finally he decided, I gotta eat. So he went behind his place there and he had a part of a moose hanging there and he cut off a couple of pieces. Went inside and, made some potatoes, a few other things, cooked up the moose. And finally, everything was ready, so he made up his plate and sat down, said his prayer, just about to dig in, and guess who knocked at the door? Yeah, the priest come to check on him. So as soon as the priest saw his plate, he started giving him heck right away. Hey, what are you doing? I told you. And it went on like that for quite a while. And I guess that old man just put his head down, took it all. And finally, when the priest was done, the old man said, Father, with all due respect, you're wrong. I'm not eating meat. He said, before you came, I had a little ceremony and I sprinkled some water and I said, Moose, from now on, we're going to call you Fish. So we're eating fish. True story. Thanks, everybody.
I'm so grateful for what we've heard from June and Dwayne. I too, Dwayne, had heard the story about the apartheid system coming and borrowing the reserve system. And then when I was involved in the last sitting of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, I also heard the story that Canada went to South Africa for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so we have these shared histories and shared colonial structures. And especially as I heard now, as I've come to know June, is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa didn't acknowledge the Indigenous peoples. So it's an interesting history to think about, and the erasure of humans. Because we are structured with these logics that actually carry out in our research. I get to hear a lot of really interesting talks, and one of the paradigms that's rooted in qualitative research is that there were 4 colors of people. The white were the number ones to study, because they were all knowing, I guess. Number 2 were Asians. 3 were black folks, and this 4th were named the red people, the savages. So in what way are these structures still apparent in all of our disciplinary pieces? And it strikes me that we are navigating these spaces every single day as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people who are allies, who are recognizing this, and how do we fight back and how do we unlearn colonialism. June, do you have anything to say to Dwayne?
Thoughts?
Sure. Okay. Thank you, because we wanted it to be a conversation.
Thank you, Florence and Dwayne, for lifting out the deep Canadian link to South Africa and the structural racism and learning, and also even on the level of race science. The Canadian race scientist was also invited to South Africa to share some of this race science theory so that the South African apartheid regime could implement race science even better. So there's always been this kind of strange relationship, and when South Africa was expelled from the Commonwealth, Canada came to the rescue, to apartheid government, to make them feel cozy and to also give further advice. So it's just amazing that colonial relation, that went on a very deep structural level. And I could see it with the exhibition, the experiences of Indigenous people, and how that relation took place was very, very, very similar to our experiences. Speaking about the fort, we have the first colonial settlement building at the Cape. It's a fort, and it's got 5 points. And at school we had to memorize the Dutch words, Katzenellenbogen and Oranje. leerdam, and you used to get a hiding if you don't know these 5 points, right? But that was the place of torture. The Indigenous people were tortured there, burnt alive, and drawn, limbs drawn and so on, and the enslaved people together, and people from all over the world. It was a torture chamber and a place of execution and public hangings. And so it also expanded, just as you said, and it became the land dispossession place. It was the place for Southern Africa, the point where land dispossession and erasure started. And children were also captured in there and made slaves and fed alcohol. Indigenous children. And so there was this girl, Protua, who was taken there by Jan van Riebeeck, the Dutch East India Company official governor, and she was given alcohol regularly, and her language, everything was taken away. So that those erasures started here, and the land disposition started just as you explained it. It's amazing in the Southern African context. That was like the line where South Africa's history used to start in our textbooks in 1652. And the building of the first fort, which then became the castle, 1666. It's a terrible date for Indigenous people because it's associated with the demonic aspects of what came with colonialism. I thought I'd just tell you that this symbol of the fort and the institution of the structural, spatial occupation of a fort and what it represents is so real to us. And still today, there's still a lot of violence going on where children actually get taken into the torture chamber by school teachers, Indigenous and black school teachers. They get the children, it's like a London dungeon for entertainment. So the torture, all the instruments and that's there, the children think it's fun. It's just terrible. So in 1976, it was also a place of incarceration of the youth, who rose up against apartheid. So yeah, I thought on that level, such these stories of immense trauma and intergenerational trauma we're also familiar with. And how it's ongoing and it plays out through systemic racism at universities and curricula and assessments. And I think, and I'll say it again, the only way we can to actually address that is through, I think, in a very fundamental way, is through language. Bringing those languages back. Because then you disrupt so many things. The colonial system, an educational knowledge system, cannot sustain itself when it is disrupted by the deep languages and indigenous languages. It has no little meaning. It becomes deficient.
Thank you, Jude. Please go ahead. I think it's Jolene. Yeah.
Danse, Nancy no somos egua Jolene Marinville. One from Louisville and one of the 4 nations in Musqueam. You brought up the relationships of colonialism. You brought up the topic of decolonial concepts. So my question is, when you're bringing in a language as a Nahio person, we're not going to ever lose our language. That's how we think, that's how we were raised. That's just normal thinking for us. We come into Western education systems and they say, you're going to lose your language. So you're caught between those paradigms, right? As a Nahio thinker and as a Western scholar. So where do we start when you bring up the word self-determination using the language?
When you say self-determination, what I think about is that term I'm learning about, let's say, so I know how to doctor myself, right? And that's something that has taken me a long time to learn, is what I need to do to make myself strong and healthy so that whatever comes my way, I can deal with it in a balanced way and I don't bring harm to others that are around me, right? I mean, for me, what's been most important is that opportunity to be in Oskapio, a ceremonial helper, because it's really only in those settings that I hear the language in the ways that causes my understanding to go up like this. And it changes the way I think, it changes the way I live, and then I can look after myself better. Right? And I really think that without that, I'm much more vulnerable to getting distracted by things that aren't good for me, right? Aren't good for my family. So when I think of self-determination, I think about that, right?
My name is Oliver Rossier. I'm a senior officer with the Faculty of Arts here. I'm deeply honored by this conversation. In fact, both honored and challenged. I take it as part of my role to try to create safe places for complex conversations in research, in student, in academia. And so today, carrying a lot of grief, hearing the stories that we've been talking about, and also gratitude for the strength that you bring to create these complex, challenging conversations. And so on World Peace Day, where do you find hope? Just to loop back to the stories about the fort, and some things that I think I've heard and beginning to understand is the forts wouldn't have survived without the Indigenous knowledge, and the people of the forts would have never survived without people around them from Indigenous areas right around them, helping them survive, helping them have their babies, and raising their families. My mother raised me as a boy. She said, "You were born smiling." So, where do you guys find hope?
In the 1980s, when the security police were chasing us and we were tortured during apartheid, and we couldn't even teach the things I'm telling you now, for that you could be killed and you had to go into hiding, and I was a teacher on the Cape Flats and running all over. We never dreamt that one day it will all come to an end. We just couldn't imagine it. It was unimaginable. If somebody that time told me in 1985, they told me then, when the armies were occupying our streets and even walking in our homes, kicking our doors open with long rifles looking for us. Somebody told me then that, this is going to end and it's not going to be long. That form of oppression is going to end. I wouldn't have believed it, but we had hope. Our hope was when we gathered in the mountains and we gathered for our dialogues and conversations and around the fire, and that deep psychic, that deep fountain, that deep spring within us that Miriam Ugume Rose, the Aboriginal scholar, speaks about, that sustained us, that psychic teaching of survival that gives us hope of who we really are, because so many generations have survived through this psychic kind of trust that things will change. We just need to work at it all the time and not give up. And we need to take back the very important knowledges that I think is going to save this world. I don't think there's any other option. And so I draw my hope from that, in the way that I've drawn my hope and sustenance from what I've been taught in the veld, which I then, to prepare for disaster, possible disaster coming, which I then also, as a teacher, I knew that I had to keep going. And we used to do Paulo Freirean pedagogy, and it's sort of very close to Indigenous pedagogy in the form of dialogues and circles, and knowing if you keep that alive in terms of really keeping the conversation going, having that sense of that things can change and should change, and that we should go back to what is sustainable and what is wise, that deep, deep wisdom, that deep spring within us. we shouldn't give up. And it's our young people. And we need to work with our young people, and they must become the new senior people in society. And just listening and learning all the time. And so I'm a very strong proponent of the strong relationship between the indigenous knowledge ways of knowing and doing, and the kind of Paulo Freirean dialogical approach of always becoming, always being relational, always becoming as we interact with one another. Ubuntu, I am because of you. And then that's the philosophy. There can only be hope if we approach it that way. And so that's my answer for you.
In about 1986, I was in an undergrad class here, and as part of the class we had to read a book that was about Guatemala and Mayan people. And I remember reading that book, and the story that was told is that the author was walking on a road before the sun came up, and was surrounded by shadows, lots of people on the move. And in the story, in that latitude, the sun comes up quite quickly. And he said everybody stopped and took off their hats and they greeted the sun. And I'd never heard of anybody doing that before I read that. I do that now. It's a part of my routine every day. And this is probably going to sound, a little more cliche than I intended to, but I draw a lot of hope from, you probably heard of Wahkotoan. It's kinship networks, human, more than human. And I spent a lot of time in the river valley and paying attention to the patterns of life that have existed here for a really long time. And I try to just continue to reconfirm my relationship with the river, with as much of that as I can. And I get a lot of comfort from that, because it helps remind me of this network of relationships that I'm enmeshed in, right? That look after us.
Colleagues, I invite you to join me to thank Dr. June, Dr. Dwayne, for sharing their wisdom with us tonight, for sharing the stories of the experiences of Indigenous peoples across two lands. Please join me in thanking our honored guests today.